London society, in the last winters of a brilliant yet merciless season, possessed a curious talent for remembering a woman's misstep longer than it remembered her virtues. A gentleman might gamble away estates, quarrel in clubs, or vanish abroad beneath clouds of debt and still return to polite welcome. Yet a lady required only a single refusal, spoken at the wrong moment and before the wrong witnesses, to discover how swiftly admiration could curdle into suspicion. It was upon such a moment, glittering and irreversible, that Miss Eliza Harcourt's quiet life turned. She had never intended to astonish anyone. Indeed, her reputation rested not upon boldness but upon steadiness, that gentle composure which made her an agreeable companion to older ladies and a tolerable ornament beside younger beauties whose laughter carried farther across drawing-rooms. Though her fortune was modest, her upbringing had been exacting, and her manners possessed a gravity that suggested not coldness but thoughtfulness. Those who watched her closely sometimes remarked that she listened as though every word mattered, even careless ones, and such attentiveness in a young woman was rarer than diamonds. Her mother, who depended more upon Eliza's courage than she admitted even to herself, had long hoped a prudent marriage might secure their future before whispers of diminishing prospects grew too loud. When therefore Lord Beresford began to distinguish Eliza with marked civility during the early weeks of the season, many congratulated Mrs. Harcourt with that particular warmth reserved for arrangements already considered complete. He was wealthy, established, and ambitious, with the confident smile of a man accustomed to being accepted before he finished speaking. London approved of him thoroughly, which is to say London expected obedience to him entirely. The proposal occurred on a night arranged for triumph rather than hesitation. The ballroom blazed beneath tiers of crystal chandeliers whose light softened complexions and sharpened expectations, while violins lifted their voices in a waltz fashionable enough to quiet conversation without silencing speculation. Guests had already begun to observe Lord Beresford guiding Eliza through the dance with unmistakable intention, his gloved hand firm at her waist, his tone confidential enough to invite attention yet not secrecy. Mothers paused mid-sentence, daughters pretended not to watch. By the time the final chord trembled into silence, everyone understood something decisive would follow. He requested her hand before the assembly could disperse. Such public certainty was not unusual for him, yet it left Eliza standing within a small circle of expectation from which retreat was nearly impossible. His voice carried just far enough to secure witnesses without sacrificing elegance, and when he declared his admiration and offered his protection, his confidence suggested he believed gratitude would complete the exchange. Mrs. Harcourt's breath trembled somewhere behind her daughter's shoulder, and several ladies leaned closer, eager to witness the graceful surrender of a sensible girl to a splendid future. Eliza felt the weight of every eye before she felt the weight of her own decision. For weeks she had listened to Lord Beresford's compliments and discovered within them a curious absence, as though he praised her suitability rather than herself. He admired her composure, her usefulness, her discretion, yet never once had he spoken to her as though she possessed a will distinct from his convenience. Standing beneath that chandelier light, she realized with sudden clarity that acceptance would purchase security at the cost of silence, and silence, once chosen, could never again be surrendered without consequence. "My lord," she said at last, her voice steady though her pulse moved like frightened wings beneath her ribs, "I am honored by your attention, yet I cannot accept what I do not believe would bring either of us respect." For a heartbeat no one understood what she had said. Then comprehension spread like frost across polished glass. Lord Beresford's expression altered not dramatically but decisively, his smile stiffening as though someone had closed a door behind it. Murmurs rose at once, restrained yet unmistakable, and Mrs. Harcourt's gloved hand tightened helplessly against her reticule. Refusal itself was astonishing. Refusal spoken with such composure bordered upon defiance. He bowed with correctness sharpened into injury. "You mistake your advantage, Miss Harcourt," he replied, quietly enough to preserve appearances yet audibly enough to protect his pride. "London is not indulgent toward uncertainty." "I would rather risk uncertainty than regret," she answered, scarcely aware she had spoken aloud until the silence deepened around her. By morning the consequences had begun their orderly march. Invitations failed to arrive where they had once been expected. Acquaintances discovered pressing engagements when they encountered her in parks. Even the modistes who had praised her taste now spoke with cautious politeness, as though measuring the distance between admiration and embarrassment. More painful still were the whispered explanations offered on her behalf by those who believed kindness required interpretation. Some insisted she must possess secret expectations elsewhere. Others suggested she had misunderstood her position entirely. Within 3 days her refusal had transformed from principle into presumption. Mrs. Harcourt bore these alterations bravely, though Eliza could see anxiety gathering at the corners of her mother's patience like storm clouds waiting their hour. They attended a musicale at Lady Fenwick's residence because absence would have confirmed defeat, yet every note of the pianoforte seemed accompanied by lowered voices describing her supposed ambition. Eliza endured each courtesy with careful dignity, telling herself that endurance itself might yet preserve what remained of her reputation, though she could not entirely prevent loneliness from settling beside her like an unwelcome companion. It was near the close of that evening, when candles burned lower and conversation softened into farewell, that the Duke of Ravensmere entered the room. He was not late so much as inevitable, carrying with him the austere stillness that followed his movements wherever he appeared. Widowed young and rumored colder since, he possessed a reputation sharpened by restraint rather than scandal, and people watched him not because he sought attention but because he never required it. Eliza had seen him only at a distance before, yet she recognized immediately the quiet authority with which others made space for him without knowing why they had moved. He observed her longer than politeness required, his dark gaze resting upon her as though weighing not her embarrassment but its origin. She lowered her eyes instinctively, expecting the familiar withdrawal she had grown accustomed to during the past week. Instead she heard footsteps approach across the polished floor, deliberate and unhurried, until they stopped beside her chair with a certainty that silenced even the nearest whisper. When she looked up again, he offered his arm with grave simplicity and said, so quietly the room leaned closer to hear him, "Come with me." For several suspended seconds after the Duke of Ravensmere spoke, Miss Eliza Harcourt could not move, because movement would transform his quiet invitation into an action visible to every curious eye in Lady Fenwick's drawing-room. She felt the room listening rather than watching, that peculiar silence in which speculation gathers itself like breath before a storm, and she understood with sudden clarity that whatever she did next would not belong to her alone but would belong to London. His arm remained extended with an ease that suggested neither urgency nor hesitation, as though escorting a lady through a crowded salon were the most ordinary obligation in the world and not an act capable of rearranging reputations before the candles burned halfway down. Mrs. Harcourt looked at him with startled gratitude she dared not display too openly, and Eliza rose because refusing him would have appeared more remarkable than accepting him had been the previous week. He did not speak again until they reached the vestibule, where the cold marble air pressed gently against the warmth of the crowded rooms behind them and the sounds of conversation softened into distance. Only then did he say with deliberate calm, "You should not remain where curiosity has replaced courtesy," and the simplicity of his words startled her more than any gallantry could have done. "I did not expect rescue, your grace," she answered, steadying herself against the unfamiliar sensation of being protected rather than observed. "I do not offer rescue," he replied quietly. "Only discretion." Outside, his carriage waited without flourish, its lamps cutting narrow corridors of gold through the winter mist. He assisted her inside with measured courtesy and instructed his driver to deliver her home before returning to Lady Fenwick's assembly himself, as though the interruption had cost him nothing at all. Yet Eliza felt, with a certainty she could not explain, that something deliberate had occurred, something neither accidental nor impulsive. By morning the city had awakened with a renewed appetite for interpretation. Footmen carried rumors faster than letters, and before noon Mrs. Harcourt received 3 callers who expressed concern with such identical delicacy that their curiosity became unmistakable. Each inquired whether the Duke intended some formal guardianship, some distant relation, or some charitable arrangement too sensitive for public explanation. Eliza listened from the adjoining room and understood that London could not tolerate a mystery where a woman's reputation was concerned. Late that afternoon a carriage bearing the Ravensmere crest stopped before their modest door, and the servant who delivered its message did so with respectful brevity that permitted no speculation regarding its contents. Within the folded paper lay only a single line, written in a decisive hand she recognized instantly from its clarity rather than its flourish: "You are not alone in this city." She read the sentence twice before passing it silently to her mother, who pressed her lips together as though gratitude itself required caution. "Such protection," Mrs. Harcourt whispered at last, "must be answered with dignity." "I do not yet understand what it means," Eliza replied, though she felt its meaning moving quietly through her thoughts like warmth returning to cold fingers. The following Sunday brought the test of whether his intervention had been momentary or intentional. Church offered society its most respectable stage, where observation disguised itself as devotion and every entrance was measured with the precision of judgment. Eliza walked beside her mother toward their accustomed pew with the steady composure she had practiced all week, prepared to endure the careful distance of acquaintances who feared association might prove inconvenient. Instead, she found the Duke waiting near the aisle before the service began, not conspicuously but unmistakably present. Without greeting anyone else, he offered her his arm as naturally as though the habit had existed for years rather than minutes. The congregation watched without turning their heads, that subtle discipline by which London pretended not to stare while memorizing every detail. He guided her to a place beside him and remained there throughout the service with an attentiveness that transformed speculation into certainty more powerful than explanation. When the final hymn concluded and the congregation began to disperse beneath a murmur of restrained astonishment, Eliza discovered herself walking beside him again beneath the pale winter light that filled the churchyard with a brightness almost too clear for secrecy. She felt compelled at last to speak what courtesy had delayed. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I cannot allow gratitude to become misunderstanding." "Nor can I," he answered. "Then you must tell me why you have chosen to defend me." He paused only once before replying, his gaze resting not upon her face but upon the frost-bright branches above them, as though the truth required distance to be spoken plainly. "Because you stood when others bowed." The words followed her home like a question she could not dismiss. By evening another delivery arrived, smaller than the first yet more deliberate, containing a cluster of white camellias whose restrained elegance spoke more clearly than signatures ever could. She touched their cool petals with uncertain fingers, aware that every gesture he offered drew her further into a protection she had not requested and could no longer ignore, and as she lifted the flowers to the lamplight she discovered a narrow ribbon tied beneath their stems bearing only one quiet addition to his earlier message: "And I do not withdraw what I have begun." The invitation to Ravensmere House arrived not with ceremony but with inevitability, as though it had been traveling toward Miss Eliza Harcourt long before the ink touched paper. It bore no explanation beyond a courteous request that she and her mother honor the Duke with a short visit to his country estate, yet the simplicity of the message made its consequences unmistakable. No unmarried gentlewoman entered a Duke's private household without becoming the subject of every conversation she would later endure, and Eliza understood before she folded the letter that acceptance would alter the shape of her future more decisively than refusal ever had. Mrs. Harcourt read the invitation twice in silence before lifting her eyes with a steadiness Eliza recognized as courage carefully disguised as composure. "We must not pretend this is an ordinary kindness," she said quietly, though her voice carried more resolve than hesitation. Eliza nodded because honesty required acknowledgement that the Duke had already chosen to risk his reputation beside hers, and declining him now would transform protection into insult. If his intentions were charitable, she must answer them with gratitude. If they were deliberate, she must answer them with clarity. The journey north unfolded beneath a sky the color of brushed silver, its winter light sharpening every bare branch along the road until the countryside seemed stripped of ornament and therefore incapable of deception. Eliza watched the fields pass with a curious calm she could not entirely explain, aware that each mile carried her farther from the whispers of London and closer to the silence surrounding the man whose actions had begun to rearrange her life without explanation. She found herself wondering not what he intended, but why he had chosen her as the subject of his attention when the world had already chosen to withdraw it. Ravensmere House appeared at last across a long sweep of frost-bright lawns, its pale stone rising with restrained authority from the surrounding landscape as though it belonged less to fashion than to endurance. No music greeted their arrival, no laughter echoed from open corridors, and even the servants who received them moved with a quiet efficiency that suggested loyalty rather than display. Eliza sensed immediately that this was not a house arranged for admiration but a house preserved for necessity, its elegance shaped by discipline rather than pleasure. The Duke met them in the great hall with the same composure he carried everywhere else, though something in his manner softened briefly as he welcomed Mrs. Harcourt with particular courtesy before turning toward Eliza. "You have come farther than convenience requires," he said, as though acknowledging the courage beneath her acceptance rather than the distance itself. She answered only that she preferred understanding to uncertainty, and he inclined his head with a seriousness that suggested her reply had confirmed something he had already hoped to hear. During the hours that followed, he showed them little of the estate's grandeur and much of its quiet order, guiding them instead through long galleries filled with books and winter light where conversation could move without interruption. Eliza noticed that he spoke more easily beside shelves than beneath chandeliers, as though printed words provided a companionship he trusted more readily than people. When at last they reached a smaller library overlooking a frozen garden, he dismissed the servants with a glance so habitual it required no explanation, and she understood that privacy had been his intention from the beginning. "I did not bring you here for appearances," he said after the door closed softly behind them. "London already invents those without assistance." "Then I must hope you brought me here for truth," she answered, though her hands remained folded with careful restraint against the back of a chair. He studied her for a long moment before speaking again, his gaze neither severe nor gentle but searching, as though he weighed whether honesty would be accepted as readily as it would be given. "My wife," he said at last, "taught me what admiration becomes when it is mistaken for loyalty." The words fell with a quiet certainty of something often remembered yet seldom spoken aloud. Eliza did not interrupt him, sensing instinctively that what followed required neither sympathy nor reassurance but attention. "She betrayed me publicly before she died," he continued without bitterness yet without disguise. "Since then I have learned to value silence more than conversation and distance more than admiration. I discovered, however, that distance cannot protect a man from recognizing integrity when he sees it." Her breath caught despite her effort to remain composed, because the sincerity of his admission carried no ornament, only truth. "You recognized integrity in a refusal?" she asked softly. "I recognized courage in a woman who preferred uncertainty to convenience," he replied. "It is not a quality I encounter often." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her more deeply than flattery could have done, because it suggested he had been watching her long before she realized she was being observed. She moved toward the window without thinking, her gaze resting upon the frozen garden where pale branches crossed the snow like lines written across unwritten pages. "Respect should not astonish a gentleman," she said after a moment, though her voice trembled slightly despite her intention to remain calm. "It does," he answered quietly, "when one has lived without it long enough." Silence settled between them then, not uncomfortable but deliberate, as though both understood that something unnamed had shifted its position within the conversation and would not return easily to its former place. At last he crossed the room and placed a small silver key upon the table beside her hand, its surface catching the winter light with a restrained brightness that made its significance unmistakable. "This opens my private library," he said simply. "No one enters there without my permission." Eliza looked at the key without touching it, aware that what he offered was not access to books but access to trust, and as she finally lifted it between her fingers she understood that accepting it meant stepping further into his confidence than society would ever forgive. That evening, while the house settled into its accustomed silence around her chamber, a messenger arrived from London carrying a folded newspaper whose headline declared with cheerful certainty that the Duke of Ravensmere intended to marry again before spring. The newspaper arrived at breakfast like an uninvited guest who nevertheless refused to leave unnoticed. Its folded edge bore the faint scent of London smoke, and its headline, printed with careless certainty, declared what neither Miss Eliza Harcourt nor the Duke of Ravensmere had spoken aloud, that he intended to marry again before spring returned warmth to the countryside. Eliza read the words only once before lowering the page to the table, not because she doubted their accuracy, but because she understood immediately that the city had already begun arranging her future without waiting for her consent. Mrs. Harcourt studied her daughter's face with a quiet vigilance sharpened by long experience of disappointment politely disguised as hope. "Rumors rarely choose their subjects without reason," she said carefully, though she did not reach for the paper herself. Eliza folded the sheet with deliberate neatness. "Then London must be mistaken," she answered, yet her voice lacked the certainty she wished to hear within it. The silver key rested beside her untouched cup of tea, its presence a reminder that the Duke's confidence had already crossed the boundary between courtesy and intention, whether either of them admitted it aloud or not. That afternoon he requested her company in the long winter gallery overlooking the frozen terraces, a corridor where tall windows admitted pale light that revealed everything without offering warmth. He stood near the far end when she entered, his posture composed yet unmistakably resolute, as though he had spent the morning measuring not his words but their consequences. "You have seen the newspapers," he said without greeting. "Yes," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "London appears determined to complete conversations we have not begun." "It is not London that concerns me," he answered. "It is whether their conclusion offends you." The question altered the space between them, transforming speculation into something nearer truth. Eliza felt the familiar caution of her upbringing urge silence, yet she remembered the night she had refused Lord Beresford and recognized the same quiet crossroads waiting before her again. "I do not object to kindness," she said at last, "but I cannot accept protection that resembles possession." He considered her words without irritation, which itself revealed more patience than she had expected from a man reputed to forgive nothing. "Then you must understand," he replied slowly, "that I have not acted from charity." The admission settled between them like a door opening onto unfamiliar ground. "Why then?" she asked. "Because I intend to prevent your name from being used as evidence of another man's pride," he said, and for the first time she heard anger beneath his restraint, not directed at her but at the memory of Lord Beresford's public humiliation. "And because I would not see integrity punished while ambition remains comfortable." His honesty stirred something warmer than gratitude within her, something she did not yet dare to name. Still, uncertainty lingered where certainty should have stood. "Intentions," she said gently, "are easily misunderstood when they are not declared." "Then I will declare them," he answered. Before she could speak again, a servant entered with a sealed letter bearing Lord Beresford's unmistakable crest. The Duke accepted it without expression and broke the seal with deliberate calm, though the tightening of his jaw revealed more than the silence of the room could conceal. He read the contents once, then handed the page to Eliza with a steadiness that transformed the act into invitation rather than command. The letter accused her openly of encouraging Ravensmere's attention in order to secure a higher alliance after rejecting a more suitable offer, and concluded with the suggestion that her conduct would soon become the subject of wider discussion if left unanswered. Its tone possessed the cold politeness of calculated injury. Eliza returned the letter without comment, though she felt its implications settle like frost across her thoughts. "He intends to force explanation," she said quietly. "He intends to force humiliation," the Duke corrected. "What will you do?" "What should have been done the night he mistook confidence for authority," he replied. Before she could question him further, he turned toward the window where the frozen gardens lay silent beneath the pale sky, and for a moment she thought he would allow the conversation to end there. Instead he faced her again with a composure so absolute it seemed almost ceremonial. "I will not permit him to speak of you again," he said. That evening they returned to London sooner than planned, the journey unfolding with a stillness that suggested purpose rather than haste. Word of their arrival spread with a peculiar speed reserved for events society had been waiting to interpret, and by the time they entered the winter assembly hosted at Lady Fenwick's residence, every conversation paused with identical precision. Lord Beresford stood near the center of the room as though expecting them, his confidence sharpened by anticipation rather than uncertainty. He bowed with exaggerated courtesy that concealed neither irritation nor triumph. "I am relieved to see you restored to fashionable company, Miss Harcourt," he said smoothly. "London feared your disappearance signaled a misunderstanding too delicate to explain." Eliza answered with calm dignity. "London fears many things that prove unnecessary." "Not all fears," he replied, his gaze shifting deliberately toward the Duke. "Some merely await confirmation." Before she could respond, Ravensmere stepped forward with a stillness that altered the atmosphere of the entire room. Conversation faded not because anyone commanded silence but because everyone recognized authority when it chose to speak. "You will not speak of her again in that tone?" he said quietly. Lord Beresford smiled with practiced disbelief. "Surely your Grace does not intend to object to a gentleman defending his injured expectations." "I intend to object," Ravensmere answered, "to any gentleman mistaking disappointment for entitlement." A murmur passed through the assembly like wind through silk. "And upon what authority?" Beresford asked sharply. The Duke turned then, not toward his rival but toward Eliza herself, and the gravity of his expression carried a clarity no rumor could distort. "Upon the authority," he said, his voice steady enough to still every whisper in the room, "of a man who wishes to ask Miss Harcourt whether she will accept his name, his protection, and whatever affection he has left unspoken too long." The silence that followed did not belong to scandal but to astonishment, and as Eliza met his gaze she understood that the decision she had once feared was now waiting again before her, brighter and more dangerous than before, because this time it was not safety he offered her, it was himself. For one suspended instant after the Duke of Ravensmere spoke, Miss Eliza Harcourt felt the world narrow to the space between his steady gaze and her own uncertain breath, as though the assembled company had dissolved into shadow while expectation gathered around her like light. His words had not been offered with theatrical flourish nor softened by apology. They stood before her with the same clarity that had distinguished every action he had taken since the evening he first extended his arm beside Lady Fenwick's door. Yet clarity did not make acceptance simple, and she understood at once that the answer she gave now would shape not merely her future comfort but the meaning of every refusal she had ever made. Lord Beresford shifted slightly where he stood, his expression tightening beneath a politeness he could no longer entirely maintain. The room waited for embarrassment, for retreat, for the graceful collapse of courage beneath pressure. Instead, Eliza inclined her head with the composure she had learned not from ease but from necessity. "Your Grace," she said softly, though her voice carried farther than she expected, "you offer me more honor than I deserve to accept without reflection." The Duke did not withdraw his gaze. "I offer only what I would not offer another," he replied. A murmur stirred along the edges of the assembly, but she scarcely heard it. What she heard instead was the echo of her own earlier refusal beneath the chandeliers weeks before, when security had been placed before her like an obligation she could not respect. She had chosen uncertainty once. Now uncertainty stood before her again, altered not in risk but in meaning. "I cannot answer tonight," she continued after a moment, though each word required steadiness she had not known she possessed. "Not because I doubt your kindness, but because I must be certain I do not accept protection where I should accept partnership." The Duke inclined his head as though her hesitation confirmed rather than threatened his intention. "Then be certain," he said simply. "I will not take what is not freely given." He stepped back then, not in retreat but in respect, and the gesture quieted the last whispers more effectively than any declaration could have done. Eliza felt the weight of the assembly's attention lift slightly from her shoulders, replaced by something stranger and more difficult to define, the realization that he had entrusted the outcome entirely to her will. She left the ballroom shortly afterward with her mother beside her, the winter air beyond the doors striking her cheeks with a clarity that felt almost like relief. Mrs. Harcourt said nothing at first, allowing silence to steady what emotion threatened to disturb, but when their carriage began its slow passage through lamplit streets she reached gently for her daughter's hand. "He did not speak as a man rescuing you," she said at last. "No," Eliza answered quietly. "He spoke as a man risking himself." Sleep did not visit her easily that night. The memory of his voice remained too vivid, his restraint too deliberate, his offer too sincere to dismiss as convenience. She walked once across her chamber and back again before the small silver key caught her eye upon the writing table, its presence reminding her that trust had preceded proposal, and honesty had preceded expectation. He had not attempted to persuade her with advantage. He had simply chosen her. By morning certainty had not yet arrived, but clarity had begun its careful work. She asked that her carriage be prepared at once. The road to Ravensmere House seemed shorter than before, though winter still held the fields in pale silence and the bare branches still traced narrow shadows across the snow. When she reached the estate, the servants admitted her without surprise, as though they had expected her arrival not because they had been informed of it but because they understood the direction of events more clearly than she herself had done. The Duke received her in the same small library where he had once placed the silver key within her hand. He did not speak immediately when she entered, though the faint stillness of his posture revealed that he had guessed her purpose even before she crossed the threshold. "You should not have come alone," he said after a moment. "I could not answer you otherwise," she replied. He watched her with that same steady attention she had first noticed beneath Lady Fenwick's chandeliers, though now there was something else within it, something quieter and more vulnerable than command. "Then I will listen," he said. Eliza stepped closer until the narrow distance between them required neither formality nor explanation. She felt the memory of her earlier refusal returning to her not as hesitation but as strength, reminding her that acceptance carried value only when it was freely chosen. "When Lord Beresford asked me to marry him," she began slowly, "he offered me safety in exchange for silence. I refused him because I believed respect must exist before affection can grow." "And now?" he asked. "Now I believe affection may grow from respect if both are given honestly," she answered. He did not interrupt her, though she saw something shift within his expression, as though patience itself had begun to give way to hope. "I will walk beside you," she continued, her voice steady despite the warmth rising within her chest, "if you promise never to walk before me as though my path must follow yours." For the first time since she had known him, the composure of the Duke of Ravensmere softened without restraint. "I have walked alone too long," he said quietly, "to mistake companionship for direction." The answer reached her not as reassurance but as truth, and she placed her hand in his without ceremony, aware that the gesture carried more meaning than any formal acceptance could have done. Their wedding took place before spring returned color to the countryside, attended by fewer guests than society might have expected yet observed with more attention than any crowded ceremony could have commanded. Those who came watched with the curiosity reserved for unions whose beginnings had unsettled expectation. Yet what they witnessed was not spectacle but steadiness. He stood beside her with the same calm certainty he had shown the night he first offered his arm, and she answered his presence with the same dignity that had once enabled her refusal. When the ceremony ended and they stepped together into the pale sunlight beyond the chapel doors, London's whispers seemed already to have lost their authority over her life. The Duke paused only once before the waiting carriage, turning toward her with a gravity she recognized as memory rather than habit. He offered his arm again, precisely as he had done on the night her reputation first trembled beneath uncertain judgment. This time she accepted it not because she required protection, but because she had chosen him. And as their carriage moved forward through the quiet brightness of the morning, those who watched understood at last what London had mistaken from the beginning. He had never taken her hand to rescue her from scandal. He had taken it because he had recognized the only woman he trusted enough to change his life.